Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into this question, this difficulty of anger and aversion, particularly looking more in detail at ways we can work with this energy skillfully, wisely. For us as insight meditators, our primary base, if you like, is mindfulness, and the capacity of the mind to meet experience in an open, curious, presence of attention. And that is, again, what can be so helpful when anger and aversion are around. So helpful, so skillful. So what would that look like? Something's happened. Someone has said something to me. Someone has done something, not said something, not done something, whatever. And there's anger. And I find myself angry. So, typically, that experience of anger is actually quite a complex experience. It's not just one thing. There's quite a lot going on when we're churned up with anger. There's quite a lot going on. And so we might hopefully carve out some time to sit, to be with it, to go into it. What happens, I sit down, I open to the experience, I pay attention to the experience and the textures that make up anger, and I see there are different aspects. Oftentimes when there's anger, there's a story with it. She said this, how could she say that? What about this? I did this, they didn't know that, etc., etc. Some of that can be very justified and important, and it's not that the story, too many double negatives, the story has a place in investigation in Dharma, but using mindfulness, actually the first kind of way we investigate is letting the story be there, but not getting too hooked into it. So the story will tend to have a kind of magnetic power that we just get pulled into that kind of vortex up there, up in the mind, that goes round and round, and what we're going to do and what we're going to say, and the past and the future, etc. And the agitation of that, and in a way the kind of repetition of that. The story just tends to go round and round. When something goes round and round, you know that it's not really leading to freedom, it's just, that's what we call samsara. So letting the story be there, but actually putting most of the attention into the body and the bodily experience, the bodily manifestation and expression of anger. What does it feel like in the body? So not feeding the story too much by getting hooked into it and giving it our attention. As I put my attention on the body, I start to notice the sensations of anger. And it's a difficult experience, anger. It's not an easy bodily experience. There's heat, there's pressure, there's agitation, there's turbulence inside. It's not an easy thing to be with on a bodily level. And what we find is, as we try and do that, we keep getting sucked into this whirlpool, this vortex of the story. That's okay, it's okay. I'm not trying to ignore the story, I'm not trying to get rid of it, I'm just acknowledging that it's there, but I'm putting most of the energy of my attention onto the bodily experience, and opening to the bodily experience, and allowing the bodily experience of anger. And allow is a really important word, it's a really, really crucial word. So sometimes we talk about mindfulness, but again, mindfulness, one word, has a lot of different shadings. Can it be that I'm feeling the feelings in the body, the sensations in the body, and the stance of mindfulness is just like this, like the hands holding something, like it would hold a bird or a little bird or anything else. It's holding those sensations and allowing them to be there, allowing them to churn away and manifest. If I can do that, and it's a practice, but if I can cultivate that practice and work on it, slowly, as I'm with the anger, the sensations of the anger, it's almost like this allowing and this presence, the very kindness that's wrapped up in the allowing mindfulness, allows quieter feelings that are, so to speak, underneath the anger, underneath the frothy surface, the bubbling heat of the ocean, underneath will begin to reveal themselves, not always, but often, often other feelings, quieter feelings, feelings that may at first be not even seen, not even registered. So oftentimes anger in that expression, in the fullness of the expression, is resting on this came up in the question and answer period, but I'll go into it again, resting on quieter feelings, resting on more subtle feelings, more in a way fragile and gentle feelings. Really, really important, if that's the case, and it often is the case, really important to let ourselves contact them. And we do that just by being with the sensations of the anger and holding and allowing them. It will take us. It's like something filters down, so to speak, or you could say the quieter feelings begin to reveal themselves through the mindfulness, through the allowing. Really, really important. And what comes? What do we see? Oftentimes when there's anger, we see a feeling of hurt, feeling of I've been hurt. Might also be for someone else, but hurt is there. Frustration is often one of these more subtle feelings. So the leap from frustration to anger is actually just quite a small one. Frustration is like a germinal anger. Oftentimes when there's anger and we're with it and we trace these feelings down to what's quieter, get a sense perhaps of, say, powerlessness. So how often we feel angry at someone, and if we look, there's a sense of somehow they made me feel powerless. And we can't kind of fully handle that, and so it stays on the frothy surface. If we just trace it down, if we just open out and allow it to filter down, what we can find sometimes is that feeling of powerlessness. And sometimes we feel powerless in relationship to a person, that they've made us feel powerless, or it could be an economic system, could be a group of people, a nation. Could also be life. And we feel angry at life or angry at God. Maybe we've got some really bad news. Maybe we have got a terminal illness, or someone we love has died, and we realize our powerlessness. I can't bring them back. I can't reverse death. I'm powerless in the face of that. One of the responses can be rage, can be anger. Just underneath it's really this feeling of powerlessness. It's so hard to tolerate. It's so hard to open to and to be with. Can be sadness lurking, resting underneath the anger. But this is quite an important process, as we said again in the question and answer period. This is really where the healing is, and where the kind of, in a way, the real action is emotionally. This is the stuff that really needs the attention, that really needs the embrace of mindfulness. And all kinds of stuff can be just on the surface of mindfulness, of anger. Can be fear. Sometimes even it's fear of what other people think of us if we don't act angry. It can be all kinds of stuff. So just that, sounds quite simple, but it's a real art to develop that and to be able to do it, and even just to be willing to do it. It takes time. For most people it takes time. It's a practice. But this is really, I would say, the centerpiece. I'm going to say much more, but that's the centerpiece. That's the basis, if you like. Now sometimes a person does this, and they're with, and it traces down, it opens up, and these other level of feelings begin to reveal themselves. Hurt, powerlessness, frustration, etc., despair, whatever it is. And in that same process, holding those, being aware of those, letting the mindfulness kind of embrace those and come into contact with those, and there's healing in that. Healing can happen. Sometimes something's happened and we're angry, and that's all we need to do. That's all we need to do. Carve out the time, find the space, be with the sensations, see what's underneath, feel that, hold that, the whole thing dissolves. End of story. Beautiful. Lovely. Always? No. Sometimes that's just not going to happen. It's not going to be the case. As meditators, oftentimes it's like we put all our eggs in the mindfulness basket. And we expect that process that I've just described I should be able to let go of everything. This is right here in my heart, in my mind, is where the letting go needs to happen. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's just a matter of kind of sitting more and being with it more and being more mindful, and eventually that's what should happen. And yet, I certainly don't think that's true. It might be that same process, we're with the feelings, we're holding what's going on, we're in touch with what's going on, and we actually come to a point where we realize, no, I actually need to communicate something. I actually need to say something to this person or this group of people. I actually need to make a statement, as I was saying earlier this morning. Or I need to hear something from them, and I need to tell them that I need to hear it, whether it's an apology or whether it's a clarification or something. But so we imagine that letting go will take care of everything, but practice is also about communication. It's not just about eye shut, mouth shut. It's actually the relational and the level of communication between people, and that's practice as well. And it may well be that it's not enough for me to let go here. It just doesn't do it. It won't do it because there's more that needs to be said and more that needs to be communicated. So I might be sitting with this process of mindfulness and trying to let go and realize, oh, I need to communicate something. And then I have to really realize, I have to really acknowledge that and be aware of that. But then comes the next hurdle. I actually have to go and say something. Or I need to, there needs to be a communication. If we go back to the beginning, and this element of anger that's about the desire to hurt and the desire to make another suffer, I feel as much as possible, we need to wait with our inner process, be with our inner process in terms of mindfulness and the emotions that are there. Wait until we feel pretty sure, 99% sure, that when we go and communicate, our communication will be drained of the desire to hurt. I can see it lurking, I can see it in there, it's in there. And I'm with my process and with the feelings underneath, and so that I'm sure that when I go, it's very, it's barely there at all. It's just gone because of my mindfulness, my openness of my process. That process of letting the desire to hurt drain out of what's inside us, that may take time. It may take seconds, it may take minutes, it may take sometimes months. That's not a judgment, it's just saying sometimes we feel so hurt and so stuck in that and so abused or whatever it is, that sometimes it really takes a long time. But in terms of helpful communication, of really healthy and helpful communication, we need that piece to be drained out as much as possible. And then comes the next hurdle. Do I know how to say something in a way that can be heard, that's constructive? I don't have anywhere near enough time to go into this today, but that's quite a thing in itself. Skillful, wise communication. We talk about right speech. How do I go about expressing something when I feel angry, when I feel hurt, when I want to set boundaries, when I want to, something difficult has happened? And I do that in a way as if standing in my truth, without any desire to hurt, in a way that the other person can hear. And there can be some negotiation and some healing there. That, I think, is a huge art and a huge skill in the Dharma. It seems to me that also as a species we need to kind of learn that a bit more. A lot more. Okay, so there's mindfulness, that approach that I just kind of outlined. We were talking as well in the question and answer period about loving kindness meditation. This, some of you will know, many of you will know, what we call metta. So what's the place of bringing the opposite energy in to work there, and just kicking in this metta practice and inclining the mind, directing the mind gently towards softening, towards care, towards friendliness for ourselves and for other, and maybe for the person or people that we're angry at. Hugely powerful, immense its place in practice. I don't so much want to talk about formal metta practice now as actually talk about how that comes into the whole in a general sense, into the way we work with anger. Listen to the Buddha. This is from the Dhammapada. Dhammapada is a collection of sort of free verses that the Buddha said at different times. Very, very beautiful, very moving, a lot of it. Very well known. He insulted me, he hit me, he beat me, he robbed me. For those who brood on this, hostility or hatred or anger is not stilled. For those who brood on that, it's not stilled. He insulted me, he hit me, he beat me, he robbed me. For those who don't brood on this, hostility is stilled. And there's one of the most famous passages of the Buddha, very, very beautiful. Hatred never ceases through hatred. Hatred only ceases through non-hatred and love. This is an ancient and eternal truth. So there's a huge place for possible softening, possible bringing in a different heart orientation, bringing in the metta, bringing in a quality of empathy. So that word empathy is really, really important. Something happens, anger, so to speak, is held in place by non-empathy, by non-empathizing, seeing someone as separate, as other, as alien, as non-understandable somehow. And that polarizing and then distancing, non-empathizing, that vacuum, if you like, fuels the anger. Actually, it's not a vacuum. It's full of projection. I found something quite remarkable quite a while ago, but this is it was 25 years ago. Do you remember the IRA put a bomb in Brighton, the Tory party conference? Do you remember this? And Anthony Berry MP was one of the people killed in that bomb. His daughter Jo Berry, I don't know how old she was, but she was quite young at the time, and she was sort of somehow, her life just fell apart at this place. She loved her father very much. But slowly, sometime afterwards, she decided to begin visiting Ireland and just learning a bit more and trying to move towards some kind of reconciliation. It's an incredible amount of pain that she'd been through. And she began working and talking with victims and combatants from both sides of the Troubles. In November 2000, she met Pat McGee. Pat McGee was the mastermind of the bombing of the hotel, and the man responsible for her father's death. And she just talks. I just want to read you a little bit because it's very insightful what she gleans from her process with this. She says, "An inner shift is required to hear the story of the enemy. For me, the question is always about whether I can let go of my need to blame and open my heart enough to hear Pat's story and understand his motivations. The truth is that sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. It's a journey and it's a choice, which means it's not all sorted out and put away in a box. It felt as if a part of me died in that bomb. I was totally out of my depth, but somehow I held on to a small hope that something positive would come out of the trauma." So she began this process, and at the first time she sort of jumped, in first instances she jumped in and she was wanting to forgive and wanting immediately to forgive. And she had this whole process with forgiveness and realizing that actually wasn't quite where it was at, that immediate impulse to forgive. And she goes on, she says, "Now I don't talk about forgiveness. To say, 'I forgive you,' is almost condescending. It locks you into an us and them scenario, keeping me right and you wrong. That attitude won't change anything. But I can experience empathy, and in that moment there is no judgment. Sometimes when I've met with Pat, I've had such a clear understanding of his life that there's nothing to forgive. I wanted to meet Pat to put a face on the enemy and see him as a real human being. At our first meeting, I was terrified, but I wanted to acknowledge the courage it had taken him to meet me. We talked with an extraordinary intensity. I shared a lot about my father, while Pat told me some of his story." She says more, but she concludes, Perhaps more than anything, I'm beginning to realize that no matter which side of the conflict you're on, had we all lived each other's lives, we could all have done what the other did. It's very powerful, very extreme. So thankfully most of us don't deal with that end of things. But very powerful. She really gave herself to this process and investing in it. Very insightful. However, more every day for most of us, again, someone says something and it rubs us the wrong way, or we don't feel appreciated, or whatever it is. What does empathy mean in that case? What often happens when we feel anger, often, not always, but often, is the mind rushes in very quickly and kind of locks into place with a view of what's gone on, what's happened, where the person's come from, what their intentions were, etc. This is what happened, and this is why, and that's what you were intending. A lot of the time that's semi-conscious. We're not even aware that we're believing the other person intended this or that. So just kind of being aware of this process, of this mental locking that happens very quickly in quite a complex way. We don't have all the info, or very, very rarely do we have all the info about a situation. So this was my perspective, but what was your perspective? What do you know? What did you know that I didn't know? It's important to be asking these questions because it opens it out from the locking, from the locked mental view, into this is my perception, this is my story, what's your story? So two people will always have different info on what happened, on what led up to what happened, on the conditions around what happened that fed into it, always, almost always. They will also almost always have different perceptions of what happened. So it's important to us, are we on the same page about what we're talking about? Are we seeing this differently? And if so, why? What's feeding your perception? What's feeding my perception? There's opening out and looking again underneath the level of the mental view. And again, the intentions. And to check that out. So opening that out of the sense of locking. But this word empathy we can make it even wider. So that piece from those verses from the Buddha, the very next verse actually in the Dhammapada is, unlike those who don't realize that we're here on the verge of perishing, those who do, their quarrels are stilled. So contemplating death, my death and your death, our commonality, our common humanity in our mortality. This is used well, this is something that heals. Something that heals rifts. They did a study, some psychologists did a study, they were of different prisons in the United States. And they were a little bit curious because in many prisons it turned out that the prisoners on death row, unlike the prisoners in the rest of the prisons, were actually kind to each other and civil to each other and got on pretty well. There was very little gang warfare and kind of unkindness there. And so they went in with their questionnaires and their tests and their white coats but the prisoners were just like, well, we know why it is. It's because we know we're going to die. It was very simple for them. It was very clear. That sense of our togetherness in our mortality actually softens things. Tsongkhapa, one of the great Tibetan teachers, talks about this. Is contemplating our mortality. It's like you're falling off a cliff with someone you're angry with. Are you going to argue on the way down? The only time that happens is in Indiana Jones films. In a way, it doesn't make sense when we have the right perspective. So, there's mindfulness, there's empathy, and there's certainly metta, which I haven't really gone into today, and I won't. But there's also the place, always with practice, of noticing, of reflecting, of the kind of power of the mind to question, to really probe deeply and question. One of the lines of questioning is, what are the consequences of my anger? What are the consequences of my anger? in a relationship, whether it's a spouse or partner or a friendship or a family relationship, when anger is unskillfully expressed, when we just lash out and we just let it out because that's how we feel, how easily that destroys relationships. Relationships are fragile. And sometimes people talk about just being completely honest and venting, but basically it's hard to vent without a person feeling hurt. And sometimes the hurt is just too much. And we've broken a relationship, and sometimes, despite the fact that a genuine deep sorry goes a really long way, sometimes we've broken it and we can't fix it because of the unskillful expression of anger. And sometimes what happens in an ongoing friendship or relationship is that the anger comes out in more subtle ways, in a sort of more ongoing way. And again, it's eroding the trust. It's sabotaging the whole relationship. It's rusting the whole fabric of the relationship. And it won't be the same intimacy, the same connection, the same love, the same care. Something eats away at the love there. So this is a consequence. It's really important to reflect on it. Another consequence that the Buddha is very fond of reflecting on for some reason is that anger makes us unattractive. So I could be incredibly handsome, or you could be incredibly beautiful, and I could be rigged out in my Armani suit, one of my Armani suits, and adorned with various adornments and etc., and my cologne and all that. But basically, when I'm angry, when the venom of that comes out, no one's going to find me attractive. It's ugly. It's ugly. It's an ugly energy. I don't know why the Buddha was so fond of that one, but what I think is more important is that people are uncomfortable around us. When we're angry and spilling it out in unskillful ways, and when we have a habit of doing that and people sense that energy, people are basically on their guard around us. They cannot relax. We cannot give them, the Buddha talks about the beautiful gift of fearlessness. We're not creating that energy field, if you like, around us. People are uncomfortable. Do we want to be doing that? Do we not want a sense of people feeling at ease and safe around us? It's such a beautiful gift to put out into the world. So precious. So questioning, considering, another possibility, the desire for revenge. Apparently, I was reading, it was a very short article, I read this is genetically programmed into the DNA. I don't know how they figure that out, but apparently, let's say, this journalist was writing, so it's genetically imprinted. But still, dharmically speaking, so what if it is? So what? Still question it. Still probe it. What possible benefit... And it's important to realize that we have that impulse. We do have that impulse for revenge in us, sometimes. But what possible benefit could I possibly get from someone else's suffering, or someone getting what they justly deserve, their just desert? How could that possibly benefit me in any way? I'm really questioning that way. So, in a way, standing up to that impulse and questioning. If I have that impulse for revenge at any time, it might be very little, I just want to kind of put someone down a little bit or whatever. If I have that, it's very interesting feeling into what's going on there. I'll probably notice, if I'm with the feeling, if I'm noticing the impulse, if I give it some mindfulness and some investigation, that what I want to do is equalize the powerlessness. I felt powerless, I couldn't, whatever it was, and I want them to feel the same way. And this could be because we feel physically intimidated by someone, or psychologically intimidated, or whatever. But I want that powerlessness, I want them to taste that. However, again, tracing it down, if I can be with that, being with the desire for revenge, and I feel, and I say, I want them to, and I feel that desire to equalize the powerlessness, and I feel into that, and I let that be there, I'm pretty much sure that every time what goes with that is not happiness. It's just not happiness. It's actually sadness. And the very feeling of wanting to equalize the sadness will feel, equalize the powerlessness will feel sad, will actually feel futile. It's not happy, and you can sense in the honesty and the openness of it and the sensitivity, it doesn't lead to happiness. It just doesn't go there. They did another psychological study in the States around death row prisoners. And this one was rather with the families of victims of murders, the murderers being on death row. I didn't say that very well. You understand what I mean? And they looked for families or relatives or friends or whatever that wanted to pursue the death penalty and often wanted to be there and watch the murderer die. And what they found was that in all this desire to be there, not one instance of a person feeling satisfied. Saw them die, saw their last breath, got revenge, done. Didn't feel the satisfaction that they thought they would. It's just not satisfying. There's something at a whole other level more interesting here, or interesting too. Anger, we feel like when I get it out, when I have my revenge, when I express it, when I vent it, I'm going to feel better. That's the feeling. I'm going to go into this later on. But actually, anger does the opposite. It builds on itself. Anger has a mechanism within it that it builds on itself. This is interesting. Years ago, late 80s, I was living in America and I was working with a therapist in the first few weeks of therapy, and she said, "You've got a lot of anger. You need to let it out." And she had an idea, which was go to the local gym and get some boxing gloves and one of those big punch bags and really, let it out. So I dutifully went, and I was curious, and I was in my early 20s, I think, and so right, this huge punch bag thing. It was double my size, and in a room full of boxers with, okay. And anyway, so I started punching this in, trying to get in contact with the anger, and then punching. And as I punched, I got more angry. And I thought, this is great. I'm really connecting with it now. I'm really opening up. It's really coming. Punch. The more I punched, the more it came. And I did this for weeks. A little slow on the pickup. That actually there was something in the process that was feeding it. Something in this venting that was feeding the very feeling of anger. And I ended up splitting the boxing gloves and having bleeding knuckles and all the rest of it. I was very keen and eager. But slowly the coin dropped. And I actually realized something else is going on here. And it's not what I was told. It's more complex than that. Apparently brain neurologists actually found the expression of anger, all it does is it increases the likelihood of neurons flowing along the circuit of being more angry and more likelihood of being more angry in the future. It's interesting. So this questioning, one of my teachers used to say, when you're angry, one thing you can do is keep questioning, why am I angry? Why am I angry? And you say, why am I angry? Well, I'm angry because they did this. Well, why are you angry at that? And they said, because da-da-da-da-da. Well, why are you angry at that? Why are you angry? And keep going. Keep badgering it. Keep badgering it. He said, eventually, every time the angry part of my answer something, you keep challenging it, and eventually you'll get to some kind of ridiculous belief and assumption, like, well, everyone should be nice all the time, or something. It's possible. This is interesting, goes back to the Buddha. There's a very curious discourse by the Buddha, sutta by the Buddha. I found this very strange when I first came across it. And he talks about equanimity, sort of steadiness of mind in relationship to anger. And he says, someone asked him, well, why do we get angry and what can we do about it? And he said, Basically, there are 9 reasons for people being angry. This is classic extreme Buddha. So there are 9. Either in the past you think this person has harmed me, or you think in the past this person has harmed those I love, or in the past you think this person in the past has been, this is interesting, helpful to those I don't like. So one of those 3, and then he does the same thing, says, or in the present this person is harming me, this person is harming those I like, this person has been helping those I don't like, or in the future. So it's a very curious sort of, noughts and crosses kind of grid thing he does. And he says, basically it's one of those. So very odd. But then he says, then you should see this and then reflect. And this is the part I found really odd. Then he said you should reflect, well, what should I expect? It's the way of the world. I read that and I thought it was so strange and so kind of, it just sounds so impotent as a kind of approach. But actually it's very powerful. It's very interesting because, I don't know why it's powerful, it's resetting our view, I think. It's opening our view. It's allowing some equanimity in. Equanimity is not the same as coldness and indifference. It's not cynicism, well, the world is full of cheats and I don't trust anyone anyway, or something. It's not saying that. It's just opening up something and acknowledging the truth of the way the world is, giving it more space. So, indifference is cold, disconnected and cynical. And this is not that. This is just more spacious. Oftentimes, what happens when we're angry and locked into anger is we're very focused on perhaps one person or one group of people, and in a way we're missing the humanity of what's going on. So this is related to what we were just talking about. We're missing the kind of bigger picture. So sometimes, instead of just focusing on the other person, it's almost like stepping back and getting the sense of 2 people having difficulty with each other, arguing with each other about something, whether it's partners or spouses or parents and children or friends. And this has gone on since before recorded history. There's something very human about it. It's in a way, it's natural, you could say. And in a way, rather than seeing that person from the perspective of this person, which is what we tend to do, that's how we tend to look at the world, I see you from me. Rather than that, it's almost like stepping back and seeing us, and seeing the humanity of us, and the humanity of us in conflict, and it softens the whole thing, because, again, there's, first of all, less self, less personalization, and more space, more softness, more allowing. In a way that leads to another piece. When there's anger, in fact when there's any suffering, one of the central kind of center pins of the whole mechanism is the self, the sense of self, the sense of ego. It's very much at the core of what's going on. And we need to see this, we need to investigate this when we're angry and in our lives generally. How easy, and we can see it with ourselves, we can see it with others, we can see it with nations and again political groups, how easily the self gets identified with I'm the good guy and they are the bad guy. And again, it can be personal or can be geopolitical and ideological. And how easy, actually, I need you to feel bad, or rather, I need you to be the bad guy if I'm going to be the good guy. Do you see that? I need to actually polarize the perception in that way. And with this, there's identification and self. The self is identified with being the good guy. And it needs to put you in the place of being the bad guy. And with that, the whole sense of self is pumped up. With the pumping up of the sense of self is the pumping up of anger. It goes with that whole perception. oftentimes there's anger when the self-view is threatened. Have you noticed this? When something about the way we see ourselves is threatened. Or identity is threatened. How easy it is to get into us and them with so many things. So yesterday some of us went on the climate demonstration. And actually I found it very beautiful. It was very filled with love. It was a very lovely thing. But how easy it would be to turn that into us versus them, versus big business or whatever it is. And then there's the polarity. And the self is over here, something's being identified with, and some other self is being identified as something else. And in that, anger, it brews easily in that dynamic. So one of the questions is, what am I identifying with? What am I identifying with? Because that's the thing that anger will wrap itself around, what I'm identifying with. So it's not that we want to throw out what's good and what's bad. We don't want to say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there's something here that's very, very important, very deep from a Dharma perspective. We want to investigate it. One possibility, let's backtrack. As a Dharma practitioner, I can take up different ways of working at different times. Many of you will have heard about this Dharma teaching of anatta, or no self, or not self. That's a view that I can pick up and use to work with at times. So it's interesting. I feel angry at you. I feel angry at someone. And to ask myself, who exactly am I angry at? So am I angry at their body? Am I angry at their fingernails, this person? Am I angry at their spleen? Am I playing with this? Okay, no, it's not the body. Oh, it's not the body. I'm angry at their mind. Okay, but what's that? I'm angry at their emotions? Can I be angry at their emotions? I'm angry at their intentions? That sounds like it's getting hotter. That's what I'm angry at. But basically what we do is we put a self there. Can I find the self? Say, okay, it's the intentions. That's who they are. Is it? Intentions come and go. What's more than that, intentions come and go dependent on perceptions and environment and past history and all kinds of stuff. Where's the self in that? Do you understand this? If I really go looking for the self that I feel myself to be angry at, I will not find that self. I dissect the person's self. Not really. In your mind. Dissect the person. You won't find a self there. When I can't find a self, the anger has got nothing to base itself on. It cannot be. It cannot stand. But what I said before, this view is flexible, so I can pick that view up and work with it as a practitioner. Other times, I want to be talking in terms of self. You and I have difficulty, and I say, oh, well, there's no self. Get over it. You're going to punch me on the nose. I have a flexibility as a practitioner. Sometimes we need to be talking in terms, this self feels hurt. How does that self feel? I need to be talking in terms of self. Other times, dissect it, dismantle it. If I'm using that self, non-self thing, it needs to be kind of authentic, because it's very easy to go into denial with that. So I need to be skillful and honest and authentic. When we're angry, still talking about investigating this whole business of anger and how it gets built. I'm very interested in how this thing called anger and this difficulty called anger gets built. When we're angry, it's important to notice that anger colours our perception of things. When I'm angry at you, I see you in a certain way. I see you almost with horns sticking out. And actually, it colours the perception. We say in English, I was seeing red. It's commonly acknowledged. It colours the perception in a certain way. This is really, really crucial. It ends up being one of the most important factors here. I'm going to come back to it, but for right now, just to say a little bit. Usually, we only see it afterwards. In the middle of it, I'm not fully conscious of it. But afterwards, I say, God, I was really seeing I was really seeing red. We have to admit this. I have to admit this. Just as a human being, never mind a practitioner, just in terms of psychological maturity and kind of growing up, I have to admit that goes on, and that I fall into that sometimes. There's just a level of honesty there. But dharmically speaking, there's a whole other level, which is what happens here. I'm angry. I see you, or I see the situation in a certain way, through a certain lens, perceived a certain way, and then what? I start reacting to my perception. Do you understand? The whole thing is feeding back on itself, snowballing on itself. I start reacting to my perception because it's an ugly, unattractive perception of you're basically a baddie. I start getting angry at that. It feeds more perception. It goes round. Samsara. So it goes round. This is really important because it's one of the ways that anger and afflictive emotions get built. As practitioners, that's one of the golden questions. How does all this stuff get built? So, we're very interested in this. Sometimes anger or aversion is built by greed, and sometimes anger and aversion builds greed. So when I'm upset with someone, when I'm aversive towards a situation, and it could be anything, it could be a job, could be a life situation, could be a partner. When I have aversion, anger, can be that something else, something other, maybe before my last girlfriend or whatever, or this other person or whatever it is, the next job, the last job, looks great. It's working as two sides of the same coin. They're colouring each other. And vice versa. Greed will also feed anger. The question with this, both these two things I've just said, is, am I believing aversion and greed? They come into the mind and they cloud the mind, and they're basically wily tricksters. They're not trustworthy in what they're reporting about reality, or so-called reality. They're colouring everything, and they're seductively persuading one way or another. Am I believing anger, aversion, or greed? I have to realize that they're tricksters. Really, really important. It seems so real when there's greed there. Seems so convincing when there's anger there. Sometimes, what can be really helpful is just holding it in mind that this is probably not the reality. Just that much can be enough to sort of loosen things and give a bit more space and soften things. Just believing it less. How's the energy? You still okay? Yeah? Sure. So, how is this built? This, if I can answer, ends up being the really freeing thing. How it's built. A lot of times, anger, aversion is built through perceptions and views. Perceptions and views. So I was reading recently about the genocide in Rwanda, and how basically during colonial times, to divide and conquer a certain, ethnic segregation was suggested very strongly by the colonial powers, and then actually took root in the culture, and it didn't exist there beforehand between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And that bred anger, and it bred aversion, it bred perceptions in certain directions, and eventually it bred genocide. And it was a perception, it was a view, and it was fed. And it was fed by propaganda, and it snowballed on itself. And similarly, you go back to the Second World War and the Nazis and the Jews, something very similar. And I actually was reading an interview with a man who used to be in apartheid-era South Africa, was a guard in a prison. And I'm not sure actually if he was in the same prison that Nelson Mandela was in, but there was an interview with him, and he said in their training to be guards, they were full out, straight up told to regard the prisoners, the black prisoners, the indigenous African prisoners, as no better than animals. That was actually what they were told. And it's inculcating a certain view. And then out of that, all kinds of other things possible, all kinds of other horror is possible. Sometimes, again, that's quite extreme. Sometimes it's just much more subtle. So earlier I said something about intentions, and we oftentimes assume we understand something about another's intention. Or you did this is what happened, and I know you did it to hurt me. And we assume that a person deliberately did it to hurt us. And it's interesting. We can kind of pretend that that's not the case, but actually it's operating. Or we can say, well, I'll just get rid of that intention, that belief, but it's probably unrealistic. Rather just to air it and be aware of it and then begin questioning it. And maybe question the other person. Even more, perhaps subtly, on the level of thought and perception, the way they build aversion. A person might feel trying to meditate, their mind gets them. Actually had someone really locked into something very painful recently. Trying to meditate and being distracted, and the mind wandering, and the mind going to this and going to that. And somehow he had the belief that the mind shouldn't be doing that, and it was really, really something completely wrong that no one else ever went through. And so much aversion, so much suffering wrapped up with that. Believing this shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't be distracted. So these thoughts of what should or shouldn't be, or I bet no one else is this, whatever, they're also building the anger, building the aversion. Earlier, I think it was this morning, I said, any bad mood or any unhappiness involves aversion. Any unhappiness involves aversion. There's aspects to that, but one piece I want to pull out, because it's very, very significant, is when there's a difficult mood or an unhappiness, there's always aversion to the mood itself. There's always aversion to the mood itself, whether it's fear or anger or depression or whatever. In the case of anger, as I said before, the physical sensations of anger are often quite unpleasant and quite kind of unbearable, intolerable. There's a pressure, there's an agitation inside, there's turbulence. And towards that very sensations that make up the anger, there will be aversion. There's a rejection of that. I don't want it here. That mechanism is partly why we explode with anger sometimes. I can't tolerate what's in here. I need to get it out. And it feels like getting it out. I will be free of these sensations. Of course, this isn't conscious. We don't think this. We react. So we explode, we lash out, we act and speak with impulsivity because I can't contain it. It feels like I can't contain these sensations of the anger itself. And it wants release. It needs to be released. So what to do about that piece? What to do about that little loop within the whole thing? One possibility is to actually learn to calm the sensations in the body with the breath. Here's some agitated, pressured sensations inside. Actually using the breath to soothe, to calm, learning to do that. So oftentimes you'll hear in Dharma circles, don't try and control the breath, don't do this, don't do that. Actually, sometimes it's really, really helpful. Breathe in a way that you're kind of stroking the sensations of anger and they calm down, they soothe. Really, really skillful. Or with the metta practice, as we were talking earlier, changes the perception of the body and what's going on in the body. Really, really helpful. But it's also possible to actually feel into the intolerable sensations, like we were saying before, but really emphasize kind of letting them be there, really emphasize giving them lots of space and welcoming the unpleasantness of the anger sensations themselves. Does that make sense? I'm almost done, so I know it's a long talk, but can you, 5 minutes more, okay? Yeah? Good. So just to say that little piece again, going to the sensations of the anger and actually focusing on giving them lots of space inside, letting them be unpleasant, but welcoming them. That softens. It softens our relationship to them, which softens the whole dynamic. Okay, for the last piece, I want to jump a level and talk about more subtle aversion. By which I don't mean when you're angry at someone or something. I'm just talking about something like, I've got a pain in my back, I've got a pain in my knee, I've got a tummy ache, I've got a sound that's bothering me or something. Just a little bit. It's no great shakes. We were talking in the question and answer period. Sometimes it's really important to put the mindfulness, to look with the mindfulness at the relationship with, rather than the object itself. So here's the pain, what's the relationship with? And actually feeling, getting really familiar with what does it feel like for the relationship with something to feel like aversion. It feels a certain way. We can get very, very familiar with it to the degree that we're very quick at picking up on when it's there, and very able to pick up on even just subtle layers of aversion. We're familiar with the feeling tone of aversion in the body and in the mind. Really getting used to it. Sometimes just that awareness of a rejection of something will calm it down, will ease it, sometimes. What I'm talking about now, this more subtle end of aversion, it's like learning to swim in the shallow end of a swimming pool. You know, what applies to this actually also applies to when we've really got a lot of rage and a lot of anger and it feels really unmanageable. We can kind of learn in the shallow end of the swimming pool. And a lot of the same insights and ways of working and processes apply. So going back to Kevin's question in the question and answer period about working with pain, what I learned there, subtle, but really important, because a lot of the same principles apply, a lot of the same ways of working apply. So mindfulness of the relationship and not just the object that I feel aversive to, really important. And in time, it's even possible, as I get more familiar with what does it feel like for that relationship to feel tense with aversion, the body to feel like it's got this rejection of something. And I get used to that, and in time, it's possible to learn to relax the aversion deliberately. I'm deliberately relaxing my relationship with something. Sometimes I do that through the body, sometimes I do it in other ways. But learning how to relax the relationship of aversion, relax the aversion at more and more subtle levels. I don't need to be on retreat at Gaia House to be doing this. I was saying that just in response to someone's question about what we think is possible on retreat and off retreat. We can do this sitting in the end of a busy day for half an hour. So you can just get used to working this way, more and more subtle, feeling the aversion, relaxing it. It's a skill, it's an art. We develop it with time. So, interesting, something like tiredness. Tiredness is very interesting. I have tiredness and it can feel like the whole body and mind is just full of tiredness and I have to go to bed. And sometimes that's true, of course. But oftentimes what's happened with tiredness is aversion has got in there and it's magnified the whole thing. If I really look, what actually is the experience of tiredness? Oftentimes I can barely find it. If I look inside, how do I know that I'm tired? What's giving me the clue that I'm tired? I look inside and maybe all I find is a slight sort of sense of pressure behind my eyes. A slight sense of tightness behind my eyes. And what's happened is the aversion has gone in there and kind of pumped it up, injected it, and it's huge, and it takes up the whole body in this kind of amorphous sense of something we then feel overwhelmed by. It's all pumped up by aversion. Very interesting. Very common. So explore something like that. Check it out. Happens much more commonly than we might think. If the very last piece, I promise. If I follow this is what I'm talking about. Noticing aversion and learning how to relax it. Noticing aversion, learning how to relax it, and learning to go deeper and deeper with that. If I pick this up as a thread of investigation in my practice, and I follow it, and I follow it deeper, and I develop it, something extremely, extremely odd begins to happen. I find that the aversion, it's not that it's just colouring the perception of this pain, the perception of whatever stimulus in the environment or whatever it is. It actually ends up being that if I really let go of the aversion and let go deeper and let go deeper, the very pain itself begins to fade, to blur, to disappear. Has anyone ever noticed that? It's very common for people to have that experience. What's very uncommon is to suck all the juice of the insight out of it. Right there is about one of the most radical understandings in the Dharma, one of the deepest levels of understanding in the Dharma. It's right there. We tend to think, here's our reality, I could be aversive to it, I could be equanimous, I could be greedy for it, I could be spaced out and distracted, but basically my reality is my reality. Is it? The aversion builds the experience. The experience depends on the aversion. It's completely the wrong way round from what we intuitively feel our reality and life to be. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. Completely the other way round. The aversion builds the object builds the aversion, because no object, no aversion. They build each other. In Dharma language, you say, this is empty, they're leaning on each other, two empty things, mutually dependent. That's the structure of reality. So we can go into this just with humble quality of aversion. Go into it deeper. It's opening a door into something so radical about the nature of reality that after which there's very little else to kind of uncover. But it's so counterintuitive that we really need to see it and see it over and over again until it begins turning our understanding of existence upside down. And in that upside downness is the deepest level of freedom. It's the deepest level of freedom kind of available for a human being. Right there in what we call the mutual emptiness of all things. So, just to kind of sum up very briefly, as I said, going right back to the beginning, anger, aversion, these are qualities that we have as human beings until really a very, very deep level of awakening, very deep level. They're going to be with us, except that they're part of our humanity. Not to judge them, but to be interested in these qualities, these energies, really, really interested. And as we were just talking about, if I can really understand aversion, really go into it with curiosity and understand it, how it's built and how it affects the effects it has on the world of perception, the Buddha would say, and the Buddha did say, if I understand just that, there's nothing left to understand. It's right there.